Okay, so here we go. Here's the first lesson of our Germany depth study. Germany and the First World War. Okay, so the cost of war. As you can see in the picture, the war was an enormously destructive and damaging war. It lasted for 4 long years, far longer than people thought it would last when the war started. More than 10 million soldiers were killed, or possibly an equal number of civilians, or almost as many civilians. An enormous amount of damage to churches, schools, factories, to farmland and agricultural production and towns, especially in Belgium and in the parts of France that were invaded by the Germans. And this added up to an enormous financial cost of £45 billion, so a lot of cost in terms of blood and treasure. What caused the war? Of course, we've looked at this previously. Let's briefly remind ourselves. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a triggering factor. There were the alliances, the Triple Alliance of the German Empire with the Austro-Hungarians and later the Ottomans, and the Triple Entente of Britain, France, Russia. There was the arms race, both an arms race in the armies, in the number of soldiers drafted into the armies, and also the naval arms race between Germany and Britain. It was anticipated that it would be a short war, that it would be over by Christmas. And again, this makes the military and political leaders more likely to commit to war if they believe it's going to be a short war. And the German plan, the Schlieffen Plan, did mean that a lot of countries were going to be pulled in because of the alliance system. The Schlieffen Plan, if you remember, if the Russians appeared to be mobilizing, the Germans would strike, the German army would strike through Belgium into France to avoid a possible war on 2 fronts by knocking France out of the war early on so they could concentrate on the Russians. Britain, however, had a treaty with Belgium, and so the Germans moving through Belgium, according to the Schlieffen Plan, would drag a lot of countries into the war. Here's a photograph, which I'm not sure if it's actually genuine or not. I've read somewhere that this might be fake. And other places I've read it's genuine, so that merits further investigation. However, these are the words of Hitler later on. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was carried away by the enthusiasm of the moment, and that I sank down on my knees to thank heaven for allowing me to live in such a time. Now, even if we account for Hitler's definite, peculiar, strange character, this is actually a sentiment, a feeling that Hitler shared with many in the crowd at that time. There was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for the war on all sides, in Germany, in France, in Britain. It was thought that it would be an adventure. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we know the horror of industrialized warfare that would happen, but these guys didn't realise that at the time. So what did people expect? So patriotism, enormously strong at the time, associated with feelings of nationalism, that your country's best, your country's right, the other countries are bullies. You're fighting for king and country. So people are very proud of their countries, and this certainly swelled towards the advent of war. Again, people believed that the war would be over rather quickly. It would be over by Christmas. Even financial experts believed that countries wouldn't be able to afford to prosecute a long war, so it was felt it would be a fairly brief war. Troops, young men joining the army, believed that they could be coming home to a hero's welcome. It created a sense of national unity, especially within Germany. Germany was really, in many ways, rather a divided country. Different religious groups, a strong split between the left and the right wing. But at the advent of war, the beginning of the war, it did help to create some national unity in Germany. As Kaiser Wilhelm says here, I know no more parties, only German brothers. So let's have a look very quickly again at the course of the war. Well, the Schlieffen Plan failed. Rather than being able to quickly knock out France by invading through Belgium, the Germans got bogged down, and there were a number of horrific battles along the Western Front in the so-called trench stalemate. The Battle of the Somme would be one example of many battles, such as Ypres, Passchendaele, and so on. At the Battle of Jutland, this was a somewhat inconclusive battle between the German Navy and the Royal Navy of Britain, but it did, in a way, force the Germans to keep their ships within port, as they'd lost too many in that engagement. So they resorted instead, as a naval tactic, to use U-boats, to use submarines to try and sink British shipping and British trade, to starve Britain into submission. Of course, this did mean that they sunk some American ships who were involved in trade with Britain, and this was one contributing factor alongside the infamous Zimmermann telegram, with the United States joining the war on the side of the Allies against Germany. On the Eastern Front, things go well for Germany. Russia is losing. In 1917, there are two revolutions, and the war is certainly a huge factor in those revolutions. The unpopularity of the war and the military defeats suffered by the armies of the Tsar. And in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks, the communists, took power, and in order to focus on their enemies at home, with the White Russians, the enemies of the Bolsheviks, they agreed to a very harsh treaty from the Germans in March of 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. You can see in the picture there, the pink areas are huge areas of land that Russia ceded to Germany in the treaty. It lost a lot of land, population, raw materials and resources, so a harsh treaty imposed on Russia. Why did Germany lose? After all, it really had the best equipped and best trained army, certainly in 1914. Well, it was forced to fight a war on two fronts, in the east and the west, and this is something of a nightmare for military planners and logistics. Furthermore, there was a naval blockade. The Royal Navy blockaded German ports, meaning that military supplies, and supplies especially of food, didn't get into the country. The long course of the war, the number of years that were fought, the military setbacks, helped to sort of dissolve that national unity that was there at the beginning of the war. The blockade caused suffering and a hunger. And, the military setbacks as well led to riots and mutinies in both the armed forces of the army and the navy. Furthermore, the British and French empires were a huge source of both men and material for those countries, for their armies and for supplies and raw materials. And in July of 1918, the large numbers of American troops start to land on the side of the Allies against the Germans. And in August of 1918, that these fresh United States troops, alongside more efficient use of a new military invention, a British military invention, the tank, helped to create the Allied breakthrough, and the war was essentially over. The Germans realised that, so the German military leadership realised the war was hopeless, and informed the Kaiser of that fact. So briefly, the cause of the war, if you remember, we've gone over these before. You've got the arms race, you've got the military alliances, you've got expectations of a short war, and you've got the Schlieffen Plan. Expectations of a short war. Of course, this didn't work out. A number of events in the war, especially the Bolshevik Revolution in the East, that would have huge ripple effects throughout the history of the 20th century. Why Germany lost? It was blockaded by the Royal Navy, fighting a war on two fronts, certainly for a while anyway. And of course, the fresh United States troops and more efficient use of the tank. So I hope you made some good notes there, and good luck with the quiz.